Welcome to the Simons Institute Theoretically Speaking panel discussion on deep nets and the primate visual system. My name is Prasad Raghavendra. I'm a senior scientist at the Simons Institute of Theory of Computing. The Simons Institute of Theory of Computing is the world's leading venue for collaborative research on theoretical computer science. It was established in 2012 with a grant from the Simons Foundation. The institute brings together world's leading researchers in theoretical computer science. Today's lecture is part of our Theoretically Speaking series, which highlights exciting advances in theoretical computer science for a public audience. When we are not limited by COVID restrictions, these talks were held at downtown Berkeley with an audience from a broader Bay Area community. Before we get started, I'd like to go over how to ask questions in today's event. We have people joining us here in Calvin Lab who will raise their hands and ask questions. Those on Zoom can type their questions in the Q&A panel at the bottom of the control panel. The panel will address as many questions as they can during the Q&A session. Today, our distinguished panel moderator is Anil Ananthaswamy. Anil is an award-winning journalist, former staff writer, and deputy news editor for the London-based New Scientist magazine, and 2019-2020 MIT Knight Science Journalism Fellow. He has been a guest editor for the science writing program at University of California, Santa Cruz. He's a freelance editor for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Front Matter. He regularly contributes to Quanta Magazine, Scientific American, and other reputed publications. He has 3 books to his name, The Edge of Physics, The Man Who Wasn't There, and his latest popular science book on quantum mechanics, Through Two Doors at Once, which was named one of the Forbes 2018 best books on astronomy, physics, and mathematics. Please join me in welcoming Anil Ananthaswamy.
Thank you very much, Prasad, for that introduction. And welcome, everyone. Welcome to those of you in Calvin Hall and also our online audience. And a big welcome also to our panelists. I'm going to introduce our panel of experts in alphabetical order of their last names. So let me just go through. So we have with us Dr. Jim DiCarlo, who's a computational neuroscientist. Dr. DiCarlo is an investigator at the McGovern Institute at MIT. He's the Peter D. Flores Professor of Neuroscience in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences. He was the former chair of the of BCS and now is the director at MIT Quest for Intelligence, which seeks to understand human intelligence in engineering terms and seeks to apply that knowledge to build machines that benefit society. Dr. DiCarlo's research goal and his lab's research goal is to reverse engineer the brain mechanisms that underlie human visual intelligence. We also have with us Dr. Grace Lindsay, who is also a computational neuroscientist. Dr. Lindsay is a research fellow at the Sainsbury Wellcome Center, Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit, University College London. Her research interests are building functional and interpretable models of sensory processing. Besides doing research in this area, Dr. Lindsay is also actively engaged in communicating these complex ideas to a general audience. Her new book is called Models of the Mind: How Physics, Engineering, and Mathematics Have Shaped Our Understanding of the Brain. We have with us Dr. Jitendra Malik. He is a computer scientist here at UC Berkeley. Dr. Malik is the Arthur J. Chek Professor in the Department of Electrical and Engineering and Computer Sciences and former chair of that department. He's a fellow of the IEEE and the ACM, member of the National Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Sciences, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Malik has won numerous awards, among them being the 2016 ACM AAAI Alan Newell Award and the 2018 IJCA Award for Research Excellence in AI. His research interests include computer vision, computational modeling of human vision, and machine learning. And we also have with us Dr. Santosh Vempala, who is a computer scientist. Dr. Vempala is the Frederick G. Story Chair in Computing and Professor of Computer Science at Georgia Tech, the founding director of the Algorithms and Randomness Center and think tank at Georgia Tech. He was a Miller Fellow at UC Berkeley and also a Sloan Guggenheim and ACM Fellow. His research interests include algorithms, randomness, geometry, and computing for good. And more recently, he's become interested in computational models of the brain. So Welcome everyone to this panel discussion. It's a pleasure for me to be moderating this session. Give me a couple of more minutes before we dive into the actual discussion. I would like to just present a couple of slides. There might be people in the audience who are a little bit unfamiliar with some of the terms. And so just so that we are all on the same page, I'm going to give a very, very high level, take a very high level look at the sort of the basics of today's discussion. So we're essentially going to be looking at how deep neural networks are being used to model the primate visual system. And the primate visual system that we are talking about is depicted here in this illustration. Neuroscientists have known for decades now that the primate visual system, particularly the human visual system, it consists of two primary pathways, mostly distinct pathways. So if you look at that illustration, the information coming in into the eyes, and the information proceeds to the back of the brain, where to the visual cortices, and there the information stream splits into two. In the green, you see the ventral stream, and in the red, you see the dorsal stream. The ventral visual pathway is involved in recognizing and representing patterns, faces, and objects. It's concerned with what's in front of us. And in terms of the brain areas involved in the ventral visual stream, these are areas called V1, V2, V4, and then downstream to areas in the inferior temporal cortex. The dorsal visual pathway represents spatial relations between objects. It's concerned with where objects are in relation to each other and helps guide our actions. Today, we're mostly going to be concerned about the ventral visual pathway because that's where most of the modeling has been focused. But I would imagine that our panelists will address how that modeling can be extended to the other parts of the visual system. The other aspect of today's discussion will involve deep neural networks. Anyone who's been paying any attention to machine learning and AI over the last decade is well versed with these terms. But again, just to bring everyone up to bring everyone onto the same page, we're going to be talking about deep neural networks, which are artificial neural networks composed of layers of artificial neurons. These M&M-like things that you see on the screen are individual artificial neurons, which are themselves extremely simple models of biological neurons. And the deep in deep neural networks refers to the fact that there are layers of these neurons sandwiched between the input layer and the output layer, and the greater the number of these hidden layers, the deeper the deep neural network. A bit of terminology that we're going to encounter during the discussion: we're potentially going to be speaking about feed-forward networks. Feed-forward simply refers to the fact that information flows in into the network on the input sides and proceeds unidirectionally towards the output side. We will also encounter convolutional neural networks. These are a particular architecture of deep neural networks that have become extremely successful in tasks like image recognition, and were the basis for many of the early models of the visual system. We will potentially also encounter recurrent neural networks. These are networks where the neurons are not just exchanging information in one direction, but information can flow bidirectionally between neurons or between layers of neurons. And such networks are going to be useful for representing temporal dynamics of neural activity. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and And the way I would like to start this panel discussion is by posing a question to each of our panelists, and the questions are sort of designed to bring our audience up to date with the state of the art, with a little bit of history, and as briefly as possible. So I'm going to start with Dr. Lindsay. Dr. Lindsay, you have written a lot about this in your book and in your articles. So could you talk a little bit about how the neuroscientific findings about the primate visual system has influenced the development of deep neural networks, maybe from Hubel and Wiesel's work with cats to the neocognitron and to modern day CNNs?
Yeah, so in the the late 50s and early 60s, there was a lot of work on the physiology of the visual system, particularly using cats as a model organism to study that. And Hubel and Wiesel in particular discovered a few kind of basic features of how cells, mostly in the primary visual cortex of cats, respond to images. And they went on to win the Nobel Prize for this and other work that they did. And so some of those basic features are one that was kind of discovered on accident by them is that these cells respond primarily to just kind of oriented lines. So if there's just a sharp line in the visual input that you're giving to the cat, you can find a cell that will respond to that, and it won't respond if that line is at a different angle. So each cell has a preferred angle of orientation that it responds to. And then also this was kind of known from other visual areas, but each neuron has a preferred spatial visual field. So that line needs to be at a particular spatial location in the visual field for that neuron to respond to it. So you have this kind of joint spatial preference as well as preference for orientation of the line. And a class of cells, which they called simple cells, really had a tight spatial preference, whereas a class of cells that they called complex cells allowed for a little more variability of exactly where that line was, still in a relatively small space, but not so precise. And they were able to deduce from this some features of how this circuit must work. For example, that it seemed like the complex cells were basically getting input from a handful of simple cells, each that had the same preferred orientation, but had slightly different preferred spatial locations. And that's how you could create this kind of spatial invariance while still having this feature selectivity. And so an engineer who was working in the Japanese Broadcasting Corporation named Fukushima heard about the work of Hubel and Wiesel and basically said, well, those, I can use those basic principles to build an artificial visual system. If that's what the real visual system is doing, I can replicate that. And so he made a model that is kind of the basis of convolutional neural networks now, that involves a layer of cells that look for simple patterns in an input image, and then a second layer of cells that gets input from a handful of those cells that all have the same feature that they're looking for, and therefore creates this kind of spatial invariance. He also said in an interview that he was waiting for Hubel and Wiesel to publish what happens next. Like he thought, they'd go on to the next visual area and then he could continue building his model, but that's not really where they went with their research direction. So he decided to just kind of repeat that process and add a few more layers to the network so that you now had a layer that was looking for patterns, not in the input image itself, but in the activity of the neurons in the layer before. And then again, you do the spatial invariance layer, and then again, you look for patterns. And that's kind of the basis of what's now convolutional neural networks, because you have a convolutional layer that looks for patterns, or the convolutional filter that you run over the input image where you identify a simple pattern in the input image. And then you have these pooling layers that take in the activity of a group of the cells in that convolutional layer. And then you repeat, and that's how you get these deep neural networks. So that's kind of the basic inspiration that led to the structure that we use today.
Sorry, I seem to have been muted all this while. Apologies. Thank you, Dr. Lindsay, for that answer. Dr. Malik, a question for you. Could you tell us a little bit about the efforts at developing computer vision before the advent of CNNs and how CNNs have impacted the field of computer vision? You've been in this field for a long time, so you've seen both sides of the coin.
Yeah. Sure. So first of all, I want to say that the computer vision community has always been aware of what's gone on in neuroscience. And there have been models way before 2012, which is the AlexNet movement, which have used knowledge of visual neuroscience. So in particular, people had the early stages of processing of computer vision systems was always based on some kind of edge detection or orientation sensitive filtering, and models for that go back to the 80s and so on. So this is directly inspired from Hubel and Wiesel, that we have filters which run all over the image, and these correspond to orientation. So we might use Gabor filters, for example. And then the issue is, what do you do? So that's basically like a model of V1, the first stage of processing. But we know there are later stages of processing, and object recognition or tasks like that come later in the pathway. So what do you do in between? And then one choice is that you make this multi-layer neural network, in which case then the question is, how do you train it? How do you find the parameters of this, right, at the later stages? And that's where there is that's where you have a fork in the road, where the computer vision community's style was, we are going to use standard machine learning techniques. Support vector machines was sort of particularly popular in the 1990s and 2000s. And these techniques lead to a network which is not very deep, because you just have these orientation features. These were called hog and sift and so forth. And then on top of that, you have your classification. But the optimization problem was much more approachable, because it was a convex optimization problem with guarantees. The alternative, of course, was the ConvNet architecture, where you have multiple layers and you train it using stochastic gradient descent. And those are the ideas that people like Jan LeCun had proposed going back to '89. And there was always a minor current on that. But the mainstream in computer vision stuck to orientation in the first layer. And then after that, you use standard machine learning techniques, not neural network training, because of comfort with the optimization techniques. The breakthrough moment, which came with Jeff Hinton's group's work, was in 2012. And the new things which came to the scene were GPUs, which enabled compute at a large scale, and very large data sets such as ImageNet. And the combination of that enabled these networks to be trained at a much bigger scale with millions of parameters. And it turned out that with that scaling came improvement in performance, because the ConvNets in a previous decade would not have done as well as the sort of the more standard computer vision combination, which was sort of hybrid of half ideas from neuroscience, half ideas from standard machine learning. So that's, I think, the history of it. Now, once we got that, we were all struck by this result, this AlexNet result. It's been called the AlexNet moment. Then after that, what happened was that basically we overcame our fear of non-convex optimization problems, and we learned to love stochastic gradient descent. And then over time, the entire computer vision community sort of started to use this as the methodology.
Right.
And that's what the big success was in the 2010, the entire 2010s.
Thank you. That was a wonderful piece of history. And Dr. DiCarlo, I think it would be great to hear from you about how you started thinking about, in the late 2000s, about using deep nets to model the ventral visual stream for what I think you call core object recognition. So if you could define that for us a little bit and tell us about the events that led to your breakthroughs in the field around the same time that AlexNet came out, but it was not at that point influenced by AlexNet.
Sure, Anil. Yeah, so just briefly on core recognition. So when I started, I was a grad student in the 90s or so, and the question that was fascinating to me was really a computer vision question, how human brains are able to categorize objects, even though under different transformations. Grace mentioned position, but also lighting, pose, other things. You can still say a cat is still a cat. And that was a rallying question for our field. And we just defined core recognition ultimately as about the ability to do that very quickly. It was known from the work of Molly Potter and others that you could identify objects in brief central glimpses of just even a few hundred milliseconds. You could do quite accurately saying that was a cat or not. And so we operationally define core recognition as rapid, that is within a brief glimpse, a categorization problem. And that was a biology version of what I read as a lot of what was going on in computer vision and categorization. Not exactly, but that was the biology version. So the context of that was a motivating question. But just to back up a bit, Grace and Jitendra have already introduced the idea of, what are the networks that are going to solve that? And trained as a systems neuroscientist, there was never a time that we didn't think a deep neural network would solve this. I want to make sure that context is clear, because all the textbooks were telling us this is what Hugo Liesel said. This was, Grace gave that background very nicely. And it was just a matter of which deep neural network was running. So we knew from the anatomy there was some deep neural network, V1, V2, V4 IT, but we didn't know how it was constructed in a detailed way. So and that was really following the line of work that's already been described. And so, and Fukushima was a leader in the sort of initial models, as already mentioned. My colleague Tommy Poggio here at MIT kind of made a next generation of models in around 2000s or so. And then as Jitendra mentioned, GPUs started to come on the scene, and folks in my lab and others started to get interested in using those to search through larger families of such models in the late 2000s. And then it was, again, in the early 2000s that real breakthroughs happened on the computer vision side that Jitendra mentioned. But on the neuroscience side, that breakthrough came from just starting to, instead of build those models bottom up, which we and others were doing, like what's the next thing that you should add to it, you started to actually say, let's make the models do something. And in our case, it was make it do core recognition in a deep network, which again, we always took as the basic architecture. And then we found out that when we did that actually the internals of those models started to match the internals of the brain at a sort of single neuron level, not perfectly, but far better than any models before. And really that sort of led to all, that work was led by Dan Yeamans and others. And it was really kind of surprising to us, not surprising in an architectural sense, but just that it had made dramatic leaps at that time, right around the time computer vision was making leaps. And I think those are not uncorrelated facts. And that's led to now, although probably what we'll talk today, which is still a whole bunch of unanswered questions about, what ways should we be matching these networks with the brain, and how good is a good enough match? And does a match count as an understanding? And for me, the question, how do we get an even better match? How do we build the next model in guided biology to build a better match? Those questions are now still motivated by that history. And the only thing I would want to add a little bit at the end here is that Jitendra mentioned computer vision had these different branches. It was never, to a biologist, like that was not surprising that these would work. It was only a question of when they work. So it's sort of a different take from the computer vision community. And of course, it had to be a deep network because that's how all our textbooks read to us. I hope that gives you some context.
Yes, fascinating.
Yeah.
And Dr. Vempala, you've been thinking about modeling the brain at a much higher level. And so I was wondering if you could tell us how you see these efforts at modeling the primate visual system in terms of the overall ongoing effort at understanding intelligence, maybe in sort of broad strokes for now, and then we'll come back for some details later.
Sure. As a theoretical computer scientist, I just want to follow up and say that I'm still scared of stochastic gradient descent and non-convex optimization. But neuroscience, has seen this explosion of data collected using amazing methods in the past decade, especially the brain at many levels, and including individual active neurons, right? So this rich data. And we understand really well how individual neurons work and synapses work, with the caveat that there are over 1,000 types. And of course, for centuries, psychologists have designed these ingenious experiments to document cognition. Nevertheless, the abilities of humans to robustly learn, generalize, plan, reason, tell stories, they're both mundane, but also astounding and mysteries, I think, still. In fact, what's missing is an overarching theory of how the mind, and I mean loosely higher level cognition, emerges from the brain, neurons and synapses. As Nobel laureate Richard Axel put it a couple of years ago, and here's a quote, we do not have a logic for the transformation of neural activity into thought and action. I view discerning this logic as the most important future direction of neuroscience. So in my view, this is nothing short of asking for a computational explanation, a logic. The brain is, after all, a computational device. It has well-defined changes of state. And so what are the rules and what phenomena emerge from this provably? Right? So with computer scientists, pioneering computer scientist Christos Papadimithru and our collaborators, we have an ongoing attempt at this. And I just want to mention it briefly to ground this discussion. And it's based on decades of neuroscience. We call it the assembly calculus. Its basic primitive is a neural assembly, which is a subset of neurons whose coordinated firing corresponds to the recognition or thought of a concept. You see an orange, or you smell an orange, or you think orange. This subset of neurons, or most of them, fire. With very simple rules that are based on widely accepted biological principles of synaptic plasticity, homeostasis, and inhibition, one can show rigorously that stable assemblies will form in response to repeated presentation of stimuli. These assemblies can be recalled, projected to different areas, associated with each other, etc. I'll be happy to tell you more. Please ask me later. But going back to vision, I think of it as a fantastic case study. As already mentioned by the other three, it's directly inspired so much of artificial neural networks and vision research today: neural circuits, convolution, hierarchical processing, feedback, sparse recovery, etc. But so much more remains unexplained. Why do we process images as a sequence? Is it just because of computational limitations of the brain, or is there a yet to be discovered better algorithm that evolution has run into? How does the visual system run this 10 megapixel camera and a gigabit bus and do all this processing with 20 watts, with really low power? And of course, to me, most interestingly, how do humans generalize? When we see an object, it's much more. We often have or can tell a story about it. I can say, can ResNet do this? And that's maybe an unfair question. But the point is that there's so much more for AI to still learn from the brain, even in the context of the visual system. I do believe, though, that the amazing progress of artificial neural nets on visual recognition tasks has so many lessons for students of the brain. Jim's work is directly tying them together. And these ANNs, in principle, provide a simulation testbed for many ideas. They've also demonstrated that a simple rule-based system can learn to recognize and classify a wide variety of data with little domain knowledge. So I think it's an exciting time for both the visual system, but also a more general theory.
Thank you very much. That sounds extremely exciting. So I think I would like to now just throw a few things up for discussion. One of the key things that would be nice to talk about is, what do we mean by understanding? When we say things like we're building models of the human visual system using deep neural networks to understand the visual system, what does one mean by understanding here? Does any one of you want to take that? Dr. DiCarlo?
Sure, I'll jump in. This has, of course, been an active topic of discussion in our fields broadly. And I think there's the way in my head this goes, different communities will have a different sense of what they thought the answers might look like, what their form of the understanding is. Cognitive scientists would look at it one way, neuroscientists would look at it another way, theoretical physicists would look at it a different way. And they don't even agree on yet what that would be. I think there's another version, which is just, you can ask the question instead of what makes each of those groups happy, which is almost a sociology question. You can ask a question of what useful, if you modeled a system that mimics it, you've used the word mimics, or I see that in some of the chat, what use is that? So a use-based understanding. And I think there's a discussion to be had about, what could we do, rather than talk about does it count or not. You turn the question to what can you do with these models of the system that you couldn't do without such models. And I think there are many examples of that already on the table, and there are more that I think are going to be showing up, and we could brainstorm about what those might be. And I think that's the most useful way to ground that and not get dragged off into everybody's own personal ideas of what this might be. But that's my starting point on that discussion. I'll let others chime in.
Dr. Lindsay, you want to respond?
I was going to say that, it's not agreed upon what counts as understanding. But I do think that there are some kind of concrete things you can point to that some people argue that this kind of approach can give you. And one is, if you train a network with a certain architecture on a certain visual task, and that gives you the ability to predict real neural activity, whereas a different architecture or a different task wouldn't give you as good of an ability, then you are getting some evidence that you've kind of hit the right architecture and task. You're finding a task that, like object recognition, that it does seem like the Primate visual system is pretty tailored to. That must be a big part of what it does if we're able to get a good model by training on that. And you can try different architectures on the same task and come to similar conclusions. I think the results maybe on that are less strong. It seems like a variety of architectures can actually give us pretty good neural productivity. And then I would say, from like a more first-person qualitative perspective of what these models can do for understanding. So I was an early grad student when I heard about Jim's work with Dan Yeamans using, at the time, not trained with backprop, but these kind of deep neural networks, getting good scores on predicting neural activity. And that changed my research direction. It changed how I thought about how I wanted to study the visual system, because prior to that, I kind of had this sense, really based on, work in the 50s and 60s by Hubel and Wiesel, that you could come up with the thing that each visual area was tuned to. Like V1 is tuned to orientation, and you can put orientation on the x-axis and you can put the response of the neuron on the y-axis and you'll get a tuning curve. And so in my mind, it was like, okay, so what is, and we had some guesses about like V2 had certain properties it was tuned to. And I was interested in V4 and thinking about what is V4 tuned to. So the sense that I should be able to put a single thing on the x-axis, like maybe it's a somewhat complicated function of the input image, but I should be able to put a single thing on the x-axis and have a word that describes it and say that's what V4 is tuned to. And thinking of it instead as this deep neural network that's trained to do this task, that, what matters is that the inputs get to the right outputs and that kind of thing, it just made that seem like less of a reasonable research question. Like, why should there be a word that I can use to describe what the cells in V4 are responding to? They're responding to some intermediate shapes that are necessary for whatever the network is trying to do. And so I think that shift in what we're thinking about and how we formulate research questions can come from just putting a different focus on the system, rather than this single neuron tuning focus to this kind of population hierarchy, think about the actual task in its full complexity, to focusing our research questions on that kind of thing.
Anyone else wants to jump in and say something about understanding?
Sure. Sorry, go ahead, Jiten.
Yeah, I would like to, but could you show that slide that I sent you?
Yes, absolutely.
That might help.
Yeah. So I'm going to share this. Let me see, how do I do this now? Yeah, is that visible?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to sort of take the discussion to a slightly higher level. So we have always struggled with what are the levels of understanding in biology, and in the context of vision, the most famous is what David Marr described in his book back in 1980 or so, which is the 3 levels of understanding. And he was very clear about this because that was one way in which people who are in computer vision and people who are in neuroscience and people who are in cognitive science could talk and not be confusing each other. Okay. And he said that we should try to understand something at 3 levels. There's a level of the computational theory, which is what are the fundamental constraints which underlie the task. So for example, stereopsis is about correspondence and triangulation and so on. Then there might be an algorithmic level, and then there might be an implementation level. And those were the 3 levels, and they should not be confused. An answer at one level is not an answer at the other level. And he didn't emphasize learning, which, I mean, in hindsight, we can think of was one of the things he should have emphasized, but he did. But I like to point out that even 20 years before David Marr, there was Nico Tinbergen, and he's an ethologist. He studies animals in their ecological habitat, in their niches and so forth. And he's a Nobel Prize winner from 1973. And there was similar confusion in that area of biology, which was basically people talking past each other because they were talking at different levels of explanation. And I think those 4 levels that he described those 4 questions that you described are totally relevant to our discussion today. So that's why I made up the slide. So first, there's the higher level distinction between how and why. So the how, causation, how does the behavior get elicited? What pathways within the animal are involved? So that's a pretty mechanistic question about layers of the neural network and how some information is being transformed from what is at the retina, at the photoreceptors, to the stage where we can say, aha, the animal knows that there is a cat. There is a development process, which we can think of both as a cognitive science and as a neuroscience question. How do children learn? How do they acquire knowledge of the world? They cannot be born knowing about having the ability to detect Toyota Priuses, but somehow over their first couple of years of experience with the world, interacting with objects and so on and so forth, this system gets tuned up. So there's a cognitive aspect and a neuroscience aspect to it, right? So we can talk about how these neural networks acquire their weights. Okay, then there is a third question, which is evolution, or the phylogeny question, which is how did this develop over time? This is not something that maybe computer scientists care about, but for a biologist, this is a valid question. What are the differences in visual systems over the last 500 million years? Then there's a final question, which is actually of great concern to people in computer vision and computational modeling, which is how does this behavior help the organism and why does it work in that sense? So for example, there is statistics of the world we live in. This makes for certain inferences to be possible. For example, by and large, most of the objects we deal with have opaque surfaces in them. If we instead lived in a fluid where everything was of varying density, you would kind of need a different kind of vision system, and the processes that we have developed would not work effectively, right? We have a ground plane, we have objects which are on the ground plane. There's a bias towards vertical because of gravity. I mean, the psychologist Gibson back in the 1950s pointed out that essentially the kind of physics we need is not generic physics, not the physics which works at the scale of atoms as well as at galaxies, but physics at the scale of the organism. So we units are meters and seconds for a good reason. And for a different organism, it might be different. And actually there's someone called von Uexküll who talked about this earlier in terms of what is the Umwelt of a tick, for example. Anyway, I may have gone on too long now, but my point is that there are different levels of explanation, and then some of these questions replicate themselves in when we talk about computational modeling. But computational modeling, but they're all interesting in some sense.
Thank you very much. I guess this leads us to the question about how do we move on, or if indeed I think some computational neuroscientists are already doing this. The previous models have mostly been kind of feed-forward CNNs that have been modeling the ventral visual stream. So how do we kind of move on from that particular technology to more, to model the visual system with more fidelity? So what is it going to involve? Any thoughts on that in terms of the actual technology that we'll need to develop or that's already there? Dr. Lindsay?
I think Jim is raising his hand.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Jim.
Oh, it's okay, Grace. If you want to go first, I can chime in.
Yeah, I think I would make a meta point, because sometimes this gets overlooked because so much of the work of looking at deep neural nets in comparison to the brain is about looking at feed-forward convolutional neural networks trained on a specific object recognition task using supervised training with backpropagation. Like that's what a lot of the models we're looking at are. And so people assume that the framework of using deep neural networks to understand the visual system requires all of those facts. And then they have problems with that because, a purely feed-forward system, we know, is not the truth of biology. There's recurrence at all layers in the visual system, and supervised training on this single task is, that's not the entirety of what the visual system does, and all of these things. And so just to make the meta point that you can still work within this framework of defining an architecture and training it on a visual task, but you can substitute out or add in all kinds of different components that you think are relevant to capturing the biological reality for whatever question you're interested in. So I'm doing a project that includes looking at recurrent convolutional neural networks now, and you can just add in recurrent connections and train the network. You can do a little bit of whatever you want. If you can write down something that's mostly differentiable, you can train the network to do the task, and you can use different images and define the task differently and all those kinds of things. So I don't even know if there's so much, at least for a lot of the low-hanging fruit of what we're missing. I don't know that there's so much technological development that needs to happen. I think a lot of the basics are there. It's just a matter of kind of trying things out and figuring out what kind of insights you can have by adding certain details, because you don't want to just add details for detail's sake. You want to have a sense of the computational role of the details you're adding, and study an appropriate task that will reveal those, so you can actually get at something useful that can be true in both the model and the brain, for what those details add.
Dr. DiCarlo, you had some thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Grace's points here that, in some sense, the game is shifted towards, you have architectural details, whether it's macro architecture details of the neurons themselves or recurrence. That's a space of things you can change. You have the task space, which she's mentioned a couple of times, which is, of course, an exciting area and connects to a lot of computer vision tasks naturally. And then you have the sort of optimization function. How are you going to optimize the thing? And she mentioned things that are differentiable. It doesn't have to be differentiable, but that also relates to the thing that Jitendra said about kind of development. It's sort of that's the biology version of the development side. I think it's still interesting to discuss, if we were to ground this to make it a little more provocative, even just take the how question from Tim Bergen that Jitendra gave. You think of these models as they're a description of how. The normative frame, what the task that Lindsay's giving is that provides a frame of like, this was the reason it's there, is to do object recognition. That's probably not right, but it is something. It's not fully right, but it's something it's something you take from that prior work. But just the how question, I think there's a thought experiment of what is the answers to how, what should they look like, and this comes back to, even if you get all the detail, you get the details right, you optimize, you get a copy of the system, and that's your how answer. And that's kind of where we're headed. And the knobs we turn are the ones that Grace described. They're not going to be the V4 does color knobs. They're going to be these other three knobs. But I think I would ask her to be provocative. It's probably not going to be the case that knob A causes X and knob B causes Y. Those knobs are going to be inadequate in the same way that the original knobs of V1 and V2 does this and that are also inadequate. They're going to interact in complex ways. And so even though that's our current mental crutch, I think it's going to be, there'll be another wave where that is like, you're not going to be able to make clean inferences on any of those knobs, is my suspicion. So maybe I'm looking too far ahead, but I think that's something to keep in mind from a perspective point of view, that may feel, I think it's an improvement, but it's not the end. And I guess one other point I'd like to add is, like, these models are now useful. Like George Bach said, that all models are wrong and some are useful. And these are useful and they're obviously wrong. And we're all talking about what ways do we make them better. And I think that the thing that we haven't touched on, maybe Grace implied that, well, we have all the techniques on the build side, we might, but on the aligning with biology, it's still a very hard task to do that in a standardized way. And that's where a lot of effort, at least in my lab and others, are trying to go right now, is how would we even know if we had the right answer? And that's a hard question, I think, could be discussed. And it gets back to what understanding means. So I'll stop there and let others try to.
Dr. Vempala, you have a computer scientist perspective on this?
Sure, yeah, I'll try to. So besides RNNs, which were discussed nicely, the brain has lots of recurrent connections. There's some very exciting advances in machine learning, such as the efforts to do these deep neural nets with limited supervision or limited amount of labeled data. And people are now able to use pre-trained classifiers with relatively little training at the extreme layers and reproduce state-of-the-art accuracies. So there is progress there, and maybe this is going to be very useful for the brain also. Now, I do have to get back a little bit, and this answers maybe one of the questions in the chat also, or in the Q&A, namely, what do we mean by understanding here? I mean, the usual bar for science would be a succinct model that explains all the data we have and makes predictions. But here, we know so little about the brain that I would be very happy with what people are doing, namely to try to reproduce the brain's abilities in simulation or in silico. And the point here I want to make is that we don't understand why artificial neural networks work at this scale, even at object recognition. And nobody has been able to convince me about why they actually work or what context they will work in. So given that even for an explicit model where we know exactly what every piece is and what the algorithm that's running is, we still can't explain it. I mean, we're miles away from trying to get the model at the usual bar of science. So reproducing it, fantastic. Play with all the knobs, all the knobs you want to. Yeah.
And I think this has been brought up a couple of times, but the whole process of learning itself, these models so far, we're not really modeling necessarily the learning process. Is that also going to be a sort of path forward to try and understand how the brain got to where it is?
Oh yeah, I mean that's a very interesting question. I'm sorry, I assumed you were.
No, please.
Yeah. I mean, the brain itself, has to be understood in the context of evolution, right? Certainly explains the variety of organisms and their sensory mechanisms, just in the visual system, as I learned from Bruno Holzhausen, jumping spiders to owls to primates, such complex and highly sophisticated visual systems. And so one could view evolution as a meta-learning process, right? Where actually from generation to generation, you're doing gradient descent on the parameters of a population, the parameters being the genetic distribution. So from this perspective, it's really striking that the abilities that we encounter today, evolution was able to hit within a small number of iterations, something like 10 to the 12. Yes, so we want to understand how it's being done. We know very well that it's unlikely that gradient descent or backpropagation is happening in the brain. There is some kind of synaptic update. And maybe there's a rule that's been learned, or the brain learns to learn rules, but these are I think, as open-ended as any of the current specific approaches. Yeah.
What about modeling that goes beyond the ventral visual stream? Are there challenges there?
Oh, absolutely. Let's think about one of perhaps the most unique human ability, language, right? What's happening there? It's particularly fascinating because this ability started only about 100,000 years ago, and it seems to be adapted perfectly to the brain's strengths. The brain itself human brain hasn't changed much in this period. And so how do we understand language? And I don't think it's a separate system. I think really these questions you're asking about learning to learn, or the fact that we process images sequentially, more like stories than like paintings, is linked to language and our ability to string together stories. So the amazing progress that's happening now in machine learning, in deep learning, where they're able to get pre-trained models to produce amusing stories, if not coherent ones, is very fascinating. And I think there's much more down that line.
Dr. Malik?
Yes, so I have a few things to say. I think we need to, it's good to look at what these networks can't do, what the current models can't do. And let's start with the core, with the object recognition task, and then move out from there. So the object recognition task, the kinds of models which are popular in computer vision, they have certain characteristics. They are actually much deeper than what the brain has. They are feed forward with like 50 layers or 100 layers, as opposed to the pathway from the retina to IT, which might be just 7 synapses, okay, but has recurrence instead. Second characteristic is that we use way too many training examples. So the ImageNet has 1,000 categories, each with 1,000 examples or more. Okay, there have been arguments made that, for example, when a child grows up in his or her visual world, there might be relatively few objects, but the child sees them much more intensely because the child has exposure to the object in its 3D aspects. So from different directions, you get to see that object, and that gives you a much better training signal. So these are two significant differences. Humans can learn from very few examples, but we learn with them in a sort of 3D setting. And as opposed to needing these very, very large number of examples, we managed to do it with a far shallower network, but with recurrence. In my mind, these are very profitable directions to pursue. These will be helpful for computer vision, and I think they are kind of central to biological vision. Moving further out, I think recognition is, of course, not the only visual task. In fact, in sort of other animals, it's much more about sort of moving about, navigation, locomotion, visual guidance of various kinds of actions. So I feel that the essence of intelligence is in the sensory motor loop, and we don't tackle that because the kinds of data sets that we in computer vision provide people are all static data sets. But this is not the right thing. This is not the right setting for intelligence. We really want a kind of simulation environments and a more active setup. And on language, I'll just disagree with Santosh. I think language is a much, much later stage. And I think it will, at least to me, it's scientifically much more profitable to focus on the sensory motor loop. The kinds of transfer systems learning that is being shown in these systems like BERT and so forth in the language setting, I consider these to be quite misleading. The kind of language they have is completely ungrounded. It has the systems can translate from English to French, but they do not know what any of the words correspond to as a sensory motor entity. So I feel that's it's a very useful engineering discipline, but I'm not sure if the current language systems are operating in a way which will give us much insights into the brain, whereas I do have faith in what we are doing in vision. I feel that there is a connection there. Language, I'm not sure.
I think if we're not careful, we'll spend an hour talking about GPT-3 now. So I'm going to move the conversation somewhere else. You already preempted, Dr. Malik, with my question about limitations. So that's fantastic. Maybe we can talk about applications, like how these things could potentially be used. So it's not just because you want to understand the brain that people are building these models, but I know that Dr. DiCarlo's quest for intelligence effort is also thinking about applications. So could you talk about how these models could potentially be put to use?
Oh, Anil, yeah, I guess that's for me. So if we just let's stick to vision, right? So again, I think there's an interesting discussion of beyond vision, and I would also chime in. I totally agree with the point Jitendra made, is that vision is much more than recognition. And I think that guessing at the next task to put in is sort of, and that's to Lindsay's point of like putting those in is a good forward model exploration direction. But in terms of applications, I mean, it's sort of, a way to think about this is what can we do with the models of primate vision that we have today that we couldn't do with the models of Fukushima, right? Or like get back to the historical context. Like, okay, these models are better matched. So what power does that grant us? And that's useful to think through, because then it allows you to think about what the next generation of models, what new powers they might grant us, wherever those models came from, whether they're from better task choices or better architecture or better optimization. And so if you think about the models as they stand right now for primate vision, they're models that take pixels and turn them into neural patterns, which turn them into behaviors, right? So why does that matter? Because that model says your control points on those models are pixels, neurons, and behaviors. There's no statement about if you gave me a gene modification in my brain, what that would do. The models don't engage yet on that. They could someday, but they don't yet. It's okay. So then you think about that, you can start to think about what can I do with the models today? Again, today's models that I couldn't do with Fukushima's models. And one of the things that we've already shown you can do is the models allow you to construct pixel patterns that will set the neurons into states that you desire. Now, why you desire them to, you will set that acquired, that's a values question. But if I say I want a high level of the neural network in the brain of the primate to look a certain way, certain neurons to be on, certain neurons to be off, the models allow us to work back through to construct the pixel patterns that will cause that to happen to the extent the models are correct. And that is pointing out, again, all use-based applications are kind of depend on the control knobs of the models. And so pixel control is something that we as humans have built up a lot of commodity hardware to actually already deliver. We're doing it all right now, which means that we don't need, tubes in your head or pharmaceuticals in your bloodstream. There are now new ways to modify your visual system activity just by the knowledge that these models effectively contain, the understanding that they embed. Similarly, they allow us to think about if we activated neurons within those models, what would be the change in our behavior or our perception, if you will. And that's sort of towards possible brain-machine interfaces that we couldn't have built without such models. And again, I'll just sort of say those are sort of the things that models can do today and guidance, and those are work that's ongoing. But we could talk about the models of the future we might like to build that go beyond just pixels to neurons to behavior, which would then open up other possible applications. Or we could extend these in other areas like language as already mentioned, and then the same things would apply. How do I speak to you in a way that you perceive me faster than you could, for instance, than you currently do now? Those are examples of what these kind of models should be able to grant in terms of applications. That's just a couple of examples. And of course, there's the AI versions, like Jitendra is a computer vision person. As these models, if they're better, they might lead to computer vision applications, more robustness, faster learning. He's given some examples of that. But I'll leave it there because I'm sure others have thoughts on application uses as well.
I actually want to hear from the computer vision perspective, because it's been my sense that aside from the basic, convolutional architecture and influence that came many decades ago, I don't know that adding recent biological detail to convolutional neural networks, like in the past few years, has led to practically better models. You can add biological details that make the network better at something, but there's usually a non-biological way to do that will make it better, faster, less data, less computationally efficient, or more computationally efficient, that kind of thing. It seems like maybe the influence has come at the more psychological level, like people add attention to models now, but it's not really based on what we understand about the neural basis of attention. It's more the concept of attention and what people assume it's for. So yeah, I wonder, are there examples where like specific biological details have been added lately that have actually made the models practically better for real world applications?
Dr. Vempala or Dr. Malik?
Okay, maybe I will take this. So of course, there is no one computer vision approach, because there are as many researchers, there'll be as many approaches. So I personally am in the camp where I look a lot to neuroscience and cognitive science for inspiration. And it turns out that, there's a lot of work going on like looking in real detail at what are the computations happening at the dendritic level and so on, right? By and large, I regard that as kind of irrelevant to what I do right now, because it's our current abstractions are good enough for the moment. I feel that there is one particular topic that we explored, which was the issue of recurrence and so forth. And here it turns out that there's an interesting reason why we didn't get value out of using recurrence, which of course is there in neuroscience. And that's the following. We have recurrence, but we don't want to have a lot of, we don't want to take many cycles of that recurrence, because the decision has to be made available in 150 milliseconds or whatever. So therefore, the number of recurrence rounds that you can have are relatively few, in which case you can take that network and we can unroll it to be just a feed-forward network with, say, 3 times the depth. Okay. And now, technologically, we can therefore emulate it by a network which is deeper. Now, in fact, you have more power because you could have different weights at the different in the different copies of the network. And so this is, I think, part of the reason why this direction has not been so profitable from a purely computer vision application point of view. But scientifically, that's different, right? Scientifically, you don't get to make a 50-layer network, because if the network has 7 layers, you've got 7 layers. And Jim and I have had joint grants before, and we have one now, and we'll end up debating this question repeatedly, which is that unfortunately, from the scientific point of view, but very sensibly for an engineer, there is a slightly different solution here. Now, I do think that there is a lot of inspiration from cognitive science possible, cognitive science and visual perception. So the abilities of human visual system to deal with variation in pose, variation in lighting. I mean, some of the processes of child development where stereo motion comes first, then stereo, then the ability to see depth in pictorial cues. I think these give us a lot of guidance in terms of our architecture and strategies. In my mind, this journey is really at a very early stage. There's periodically hype that, oh yeah, we are 90% have solved the problem. So forget about 90% of AI. I don't think we are at 90% of vision. I think we are at like 20% of vision. And vision is the most understood part of the brain and the most successful part of AI as well. But it's only a 20% success that we have so far.
So maybe at the, we can now move on to questions because we've come to the end of our hour. It's been amazing. Time has just gone by so quickly. I would like to ask Prasad in Calvin Hall at the Simons Institute to see if there's anyone there who wants to ask a question before we take questions from our online audience.
Questions here. So I had a question. So about the neural system of cats and organisms. Is it? It's difficult to reproduce them, or even understand what individual neurons are doing. But is it true that we can make a correspondence between many different cats and identify the same kind of a function or same neuron in different cats? Meaning, is it the case that what the neurons are doing also depends on how they're trained? Because I would imagine if we trained a neural network on different data, there would be different neurons doing different things. And so how reproducible is it across different cats?
I could try to take that. Yeah, so the basic properties of there are cells that have preferred orientations that you find across individual cats, you find it in monkeys, you find it across a lot of different species, especially at primary visual cortex, and the first area that's doing visual processing in the cortex. That those classes exist. You can't have this cell is exactly equal to that cell kind of thing, but you can predict in advance what the broad response properties will be. And then I think there is a sense that as you go deeper into the hierarchy and you get to kind of these more object selective areas like IT, I would assume there's more individual variability that might have to do more with the life history of the individual. And also you can get variability in the primary visual cortex if you do very extreme things like raise a cat in an environment that only has vertical lines. That's going to completely change the distribution of preferred orientations that cat has. So during certain critical periods of development, you can have a strong impact of the environment on the individual animals, but assuming a normal environment, there are certain properties that are pretty conserved across individuals. And then when you're getting into kind of specialized regions that probably show a little bit more variability that's based on the animal's history.
Thank you. I think we have no more questions from the hall. We'll take questions over Zoom.
Okay, so there's a question about attention. I think it was partly addressed already, but let me just say it out. Cognitively speaking, attention plays a very important role in vision. What has been and will be the role of the neuroscientific understanding of attention in designing computational models? Anyone?
I have a lot of feelings about this. I studied attention during my PhD in the visual system. And yeah, as I kind of mentioned earlier, there is attention in some of these models. There's different definitions of attention in machine learning. Within machine learning, there's a few different things that are called attention. And then they have a whole separate, we use attention in entirely different ways in neuroscience and in psychology. So it's an important thing that we use, especially kind of to I view it partly as to specialize a general purpose system. We have our visual system that can do a lot of different things, but on the fly, you might want it to be really good and really quick at a specific subtask. And so you want to deploy attention to something in particular. And so I think, if you want to create a visual system that works like a human visual system, you're going to have to include intention in part of it. But the way that it's currently being used in machine learning, I think, has somewhat limited overlap. I mean, again, it's a high level inspiration, but the actual details of how it's implemented don't exactly align with what we know of how attention modulates neurons biologically, but they don't have to, because engineers want to build a system that works well and that they can train. And so they define attention in a way that works for them, and that's totally fine. But it is a little bit different at the current time. And I wrote a whole review article on this, so that's why I'm riled up.
Right. Right. Dr. DiCarlo, you had anything to add to that?
Well, I agree with all of what was said. The only thing I would add is, first, as pointed out, that the word attention, there's no attentional, okay, the word attention has been reified. So in biology, there's attentional phenomena, and those are the things you need a model to explain. But unfortunately, the field has not done a good job of speccing when something has achieved those phenomena or not. They've instead assumed there is a magical mechanism called attention, which isn't even agreed upon what that would be, let alone handed to an engineer. So you can't blame computer vision engineers or AI engineers for saying, we're going to use attention, which becomes a cover word for anything that sort of has a state-dependent modulation, which is still useful, but now we're engaged in cog and neurobranding. And that is, I think, not helpful to either field. But I put that more on the cognitive scientists than the AI engineers, because if we would define our terms and specify that, they wouldn't be in that situation. But I think that sort of creates more confusion than progress at the interface. But there could be a space to do that well. And I think, I'm sorry, Grace, I haven't read your review, but I'm sure it probably points in the right direction of how that could be made more productive than it has been.
Thank you. There's a provocative question here directed at Professor Malik. So it says, Professor Malik mentioned that the state-of-the-art language models are ungrounded. Isn't the same true of vision models?
I mean, what do you mean vision models are not grounded? My definition of grounding is I can take a camera and I can point to some scene, and my model will say that is a cat. And that they can do. So in that sense, they are grounded. When we talk about lack of grounding in language models, I'm referring to, just for being specific, say a transformer model like BERT, which is being used to translate from, say, English to French, right? So it will translate the word cat from English to French, but it will not know what a cat is in the world. It does not know, there's been a lot of work which has tried to expose that these models don't have, quote, a deeper understanding of the world. They are in this language space, but they don't connect to the world. So the language is supposed to be a mirror of the world, but it is not a mirror of the world, whereas our visual systems are. So our computer vision systems are. So I completely feel that I'm not guilty of this, and the computer vision community has got this right. In vision and in robotics, you don't get to be not grounded. We are always grounded.
Fair enough. Dr. Vempala, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to go back one step to the attention question, just because just as an operational definition, if I think of attention as what part of the visual field I'm paying attention to, which we know brains do very well in some sequence, they don't process the whole thing together. I wonder if that, and I'd be very curious to hear from the remaining panelists. So when babies learn, say, to read, or toddlers, letters, it's not that they see the image right away. Somebody's showing them the strokes in a sequence. And I wonder if this sort of serialization actually helps you make your recognition system much more robust. So that now if I put in other variations such as light and 3D and squiggly lines and so on, there is a higher level element of sequence that's still preserved, and therefore you're much more robust to transformations. So maybe attention is key, and it seems to be relatively less modeled in computer vision systems or sequence. Whereas this sort of attention and sequence is critical to prediction in a sequence such as language. So there might be something quite fruitful there, even if it's very, very early days for actual language tasks.
All food for thought. Someone has a question about learning. If backprop is not the answer for the brain, what is? We haven't really talked about backprop that much, but yeah, so these, maybe someone can take that. It kind of speaks to the whole question of how did the brain get to where it is?
I'll be happy to start off on that. I mean, plasticity is what has been established as solidly. There's the simplest version being Hebbian plasticity, where if both endpoints of a synapse fire within a short interval of each other, then the weight of the synapse goes up. And the question is whether this rule is sufficient to learn productively, to generalize. And now there's a growing body of rigorous evidence, including in models of assemblies of neurons, that at least for simple learning tasks, plasticity actually suffices. You don't need backpropagation, which seems hard to implement. There are variations, of course, on plasticity. I mean, the books on theoretical neuroscience have list many different variations that are closer to what's happening at individual synapses and the many different kinds. But the question of finding alternatives to backpropagation, which really needs feedback from much later layers to earlier layers, could be very productive, not just to get closer to biology, but to find better, more robust methods.
In AI, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Dr. DiCarlo, you've been thinking about this question also, right? About how the learning mechanisms, learning to model the learning process itself. Is that something that's going to be more difficult than what has gone on so far?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot to say on this, but I think it'd be useful for us to at least get on the same page. I mean, of course, every synapses change their weight structure. So the brain is plastic in that sense. But it's like saying an iPhone has transistors, and then how does an iPhone work? That's the leap, right? So just because you have plastic synapses, how do you structure the plasticity in the network so that you get improved performance? And like, how does a system do that? Now we get into spaces of backprop, semi-backprop, unsupervised, all the different variants you might imagine. So that's where the action is on the model side. But as you pointed out already, Santosh, there's always an assumption that humans somehow are learning this all postnatal. But remember, learning can be extrapolated over all of evolution. So the birth state is already like you come out in the language of hardware of computer, but you come out like a nice ASICs chip. You don't need to be big plastic GPU. You're already well configured. That's how we think of the retina, right? There's lots of parts of our visual system that already are pre-built. And there is no learning. And we as humans tend to highlight the parts we're really good at and we just ignore the parts we're really bad at. So we have a wrong perspective of mapping that we think we're more plastic than we actually are. But I think all that being said, we certainly do learn things postnatally. Studying that is a lot harder than studying, especially in humans and non-human primates. Studying that postnatal development is much harder than it is in studying adult functional processes, which is where the more progress has been made. But that being said, I think these are very interesting things to study. Whether they will unlock new AI things or even deep insights into biology, eventually they will. But for the biology side, we have to figure that out. I just don't think how can I say it? It hasn't been, again, I have that bias for vision that people seem to think the system is learning a lot. And I have a different bias that it's just understanding how it works without a lot of learning is sort of the first move to make. And the question is, are we ready to shift to that other problem? And maybe a bit so. But I don't know how that will generalize outside the vision system. I'll sort of admit I'm sort of naive. I don't know how we would even ground that. Many of the others on the call may have some sense of how to do that. Sorry, I said a lot of things, but I hope that might motivate. I'm trying to be provocative a bit here and motivate some discussion.
Has anyone been energized to respond to that, or we can move on to another question. I do have a question that I think I've heard Dr. Malik speak about this elsewhere, so this would be a nice one for you. Do you think current AI algorithms, CNNs, RNNs, which we've talked about, are sufficient to get to intelligence and understand the processing of the brain, or and we just need more compute power, or do we need better algorithms yet to be discovered, not CNNs and RNNs?
I think I said earlier that we are like 20% of the journey. Now, does that, now in a certain trivial sense, we could say, oh, well, it could perhaps all be achieved with CNNs one day, right? It's like all computing can be achieved by Turing machines, right? So, but that doesn't mean that we haven't had to do, something like 80 years of work since Turing machines. So, to me, the important question really is how much of the vision problem is solved. And in my mind, more of it is unsolved than has been solved. And it's because we have made progress on certain narrow tasks like recognition, which are very important and very technologically useful. But like if you consider an agent acting in the world, perceiving and then interacting with the world, there's a long way to go. And of course, then vision connects to cognition and language and so forth. And that's where we get into issues of concepts. Again, a long way to go. So whether it will be just current architectures or new architectures, I think it may be even that we are actually several architectures will be equivalent. So currently there's a game going on where people are replacing convnets by transformers, right? Lots of papers are being written on this theme. Interestingly, and the basic claim is we can do as much as convnets and 1% better. What's interesting to me is that the performance of the convnets and the transformers is so similar. That is to me the interesting fact, which is that on ImageNet, they're both around 85. Maybe on COCO, they're both around 60, and so on and so forth. Okay, which shows that it's actually some kind of limitation of the data and the broad strategy that is, and we have these two different ways of, quote, skinning the cat.
Thank you.
I wanted to make a comment about that question, though, because the question of, oh, can we use the architectures and the learning rules that we have and we just need to add more data? I think you can only answer that in terms of, will that get you to kind of adult level performance? Because we already kind of acknowledge that we need too much data to replicate how much data humans use in learning. So if you want to replicate kind of the whole development of an individual human, then the answer can't be more and more data, because then you're already violating kind of the constraints that we put in by saying you're trying to recapitulate the whole development. You could argue that evolution, means that you had way more data as a species, but for certain things, that's clearly not what's at play. Like when you're learning a specific language, it's not because evolution gave you so much data on that specific language. So I think you can only argue that more data is all we need if you're just trying to get to some endpoint of a certain behavioral metric, but you can't argue that more data will save you if you're trying to recapitulate the whole development process.
Well, I think we're really coming to the end of our allotted 1.5 hours. So I would like to kind of bring this to a close by asking each one of you to maybe spend a minute giving us your final thoughts on this topic, either on things that we've already talked about or something that we didn't touch upon. We can start in reverse order this time. Maybe Dr. Vempala, you can go first. You're on mute.
Sorry. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I like Jim's distinction, of course, of prenatal versus postnatal, and I can see that in the visual system, maybe much of the network was already set up by evolution. And as far as evolution is concerned, sure, use whatever optimization method seems to work best. But there is indisputably some learning that happens postnatally, especially in humans, and observably so. And I think this needs an explanation based on mechanisms that we can agree on are observed in the brain. So, and which could be quite fruitful, because that's where a lot of intelligence seems to come in beyond core object recognition. One point I want to make in closing is from my background as a theoretical computer scientist, how primitive we are. I mean, the theoreticians here. I already mentioned that we don't understand why object recognition or artificial neural networks in general, as soon as you move away from the convex space, work as well as they do. I mean, it's totally open. And perhaps this is part of the reason is sort of a limitation or burden of how theoretical work is conducted today. You know, the most desired explanation is the following form. It says algorithm A works on any input X using at most Y examples and in at most Z time. That would be great, right? I mean, that's how classical machine learning algorithms guarantees go. We can't do this for deep learning, and maybe, you know, it's actually intractable to concern. There is some evidence that it is. However, you know, biological learning is intimately tied to the environment. You know, we learn in our environments through evolution, but also in lifetime. And so, rather than worst case intractability, you know, maybe adapting to natural environments and working well in those specific ones is actually tractable and efficient. How so is to be answered. And part of the answer, I think, would be for theoreticians to move away from, you know, sort of mathematically nice models of the environment like IID data and Gaussians to actually modeling the environment in more useful, productive ways. And it'd be great to get input from cognitive scientists and biologists and people on the interface, like people on this panel, about how to do that most usefully.
Thank you. Dr. Malik, your final thoughts?
Yes. I think there's a core enterprise, which is people from neuroscience and cognitive science backgrounds talking with people in AI, computer vision, robotics, and so forth. And I think I really believe that that's a very profitable interaction. And most of the time it will not pan out, but in the few times when it pans out, it is a big deal, right? So like, I think the ConNet story is an example of it panning out and it being a big deal. There are a whole lot of other settings where it hasn't panned out, but that's fine. I think that we need ideas from wherever we can, and we should be open to that. Since this is a panel at the Simons Institute, which is an Institute of Theoretical Computer Science, I want to say I will just, for whatever reason, choose to expound on that, on how theory can help. So there's certainly theory needed to explain the success of deep learning, right? Why? I think that those of us who cared about theory in the 90s or 2000s were basically misled. We thought, okay, let's stick to convex problems, and that was a mistake. Okay, and I've had these numerous conversations with Jan, and I said, okay, the one thing I got wrong was I didn't have faith in SGD, and I should have had more faith, and then I would have been onto using these multi-layer neural networks earlier than I was. There are phenomena which are being found about learning with the overfitting, which is kind of traditionally where all this VC theory was developed. And it turns out there are arguments which say that these current neural networks, highly over-parameterized, don't have overfitting issues. So there's a so-called phenomena of double descent and so forth. These are interesting questions that theoreticians need to tackle. But I think they will need to change their style. Their style is to work with pencil and paper and try to think things through. No, you have to operate like physicists, which means bury yourself in some phenomena, try to understand what is going on, see the puzzles, and then try to make sense of them, rather than come in with, floating from 30,000 feet above. So the kind of work that I like is theoretical work like what Ben Recht did, where they showed that neural networks could essentially fit to this and get zero training error on digits, even with all the digits being random, even with the labels being permuted. Now that's a very intriguing finding, and this requires a combination of a theoretical sensibility and sort of having your hands and feet dirty. So I think it's a different style of theory which is needed. The kind of theory which is needed in biology is different than what is needed in theoretical physics, for example. And our business is closer to biology.
Thank you. Very provocative. Thank you. Dr. Lindsay, your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I have a somewhat related kind of set of ideas coming from the neuroscience side, which is about understanding these networks. I'm very interested in taking a trained neural network and trying to take the tools that we use to understand real neural data and apply it to the neural network and see if we can try to understand the trained neural network in this kind of level of understanding that's more satisfying to people, kind of this algorithmic level of describing it in a few simple sentences that gives you some intuition for what this big distributed set of neurons is implementing. And so I'm interested in that for the sake of understanding the neural network, for the sake of making more types of comparisons between the neural network and real neural activity. So you can say, oh, if I apply the same analysis, do I get the same result if I apply it to neural activity and to artificial neural activity? That's another form of comparison. But also, I think it's important for testing the tools that we use in neuroscience, because we don't have a lot of kind of ground truth in neuroscience. We have very limited, by some definitions, very limited experimental access to neural activity, and certainly to connection weights. We have very limited access. We don't know how strongly neurons are connected to each other and how they influence each other in most of the brain regions people are studying. So we've come up with all these techniques that feel like they're giving us intuition for how populations of neurons are implementing computations and what those computations are. But if I've learned anything from trying to study these artificial neural networks, it's that it's very easy to come up with some story and then you test it and it doesn't actually hold, or once you have full experimental access to perturb the system and record from it and all of that, your intuitions change about how it could be working. And so I'm interested for the sake partly of understanding neural networks, but also for the sake of neuroscience and the tools that it uses to test out the tools of neuroscience on artificial neural networks.
Thank you. Dr. DiCarlo, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'd love to talk to everybody for a couple more hours, but I'll just give you my take-home things. I think it's important for people to keep in mind the point that Jitendra made about these different types of answers, the kind of how answers, like how visual inference even works. And that's where most of our work is centered. But there's also a related question, how the thing learns to become what it is, which we've talked about. And then there's the why questions as mentioned. And those are just keep in mind that those are different questions and people are often confusing them. I think it's important to always keep clear what questions being asked. The good news that I'd like to highlight is on the how the visual system does inference, how it does visual inference, at least on tasks of latent object content and other latent variables like pose and position. There's been huge progress. We now have decent models of how the visual system appears to do that at the single neuron level. Those models are now in existence and they weren't 10 years ago. They were conceptual models that have now been turned into models that have predictive power. And I think that's something that good news shouldn't be forgotten. It doesn't mean it's the end. It just means there's been a lot of advance. Now, I want to also make the point, we haven't talked about this much. Some of my colleagues say, why would we use deep nets? They imply there should be another family of models. To a neuroscientist, the brain is a recurrent deep neural network. Ramon Cajal told us that 100 years ago. That's the central dogma of the field. It's not going to change unless we start thinking glia cells are doing all the work. Unless there's a dramatic transformation, the brain is a recurrent deep neural network. So the game is figure out which one it is and how it learns. So we're stuck with deep nets in that broad sense forever. Unless there's a transformation of the world. So keep that in mind. And last point I'd like to make is, Jitendra mentioned, kind of 20% there or big breakthroughs. Keep in mind, that's sort of the behavioral side. That's a computer vision is like behavior to neuroscience, like how well you do various tasks, how well it matches that. There's tons of detail that to be sorted out on the neuroscience side. At what level, how do the genes relate to the dendrites that then relate to building all of those detailed connections up to the behavior is really the dream of neuroscience. And these models are not even yet engaged on those questions, but they're opening the doors to allow them. Imagine a day when I could give you a CRISPR modification to your adult genome that will modify your visual cognitive behavior. Those are the kind of models that you dream about that we're on sort of step one of that possibility. And that frontier can only be engaged on the biology side, regardless of if computer vision gets to 100% or 20%, or if there aren't any more breakthroughs in Jitendra's words. So there's a lot of exciting work to be done. Now these models are starting to engage with, and I think that's the future we should all be excited about as humans with one of these networks running in all of our heads. Thanks.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. My sincere thanks to all of you. This has been a wonderful discussion. I wish, like Dr. DiCarlo said, we could keep talking for another 2 hours. But I'm also sorry that we couldn't take all the questions. There are some 20 odd questions still outstanding, but I think we have answered some of them during the course of this conversation. So, but apologies to the people who wrote questions, but we couldn't get to those. Yeah, thank you again very much for participating. This has been wonderful. I will pass the microphone to Prasad in Calvin Hall to see if he has anything to say, and then we will conclude.
Thanks again to Anil, James, Grace, Jitendra, and Santosh for the lively discussion. You've given us a lot to think about. Thanks to the audience for participating, and we hope to see you all again soon in the next talk on the series. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you all. It's been wonderful. I will connect with you all separately. Bye.